They told her to leave because she didn't look like the type who could afford anything here. But what they didn't know was that she owned the entire jewelry empire. The moment was sharp, uncomfortable, and quietly brutal. No shouting, no confrontation, just a glance, a shrug, and a request to leave. The woman they dismissed wore sneakers, a sweater, and confidence that didn't need designer labels. She wasn't looking for attention, she was checking on her store, unannounced. And the staff, blinded by assumptions, showed her exactly what needed to change. Within minutes, everything they thought they knew about who belongs in luxury was about to be rewritten. It was just after noon on a breezy Thursday in Santa Monica when Amara Collins stepped into the flagship store of Auriel and Company, the luxury jewelry brand she'd built from scratch. Fresh off a morning strategy meeting with investors, Amara had decided to drop by unannounced. She didn't come in a tailored suit or heels. Instead, she wore jeans, a soft grey sweater, and a pair of white sneakers still faintly dusted from her morning walk. Her curls were pulled into a simple bun, and a leather crossbody bag slung across her shoulder completed the look. Comfortable, understated, and intentional. For Amara, this wasn't about appearances, it was about energy. She believed that a store's true culture showed itself when no one was watching. So she walked through the glass doors of her own boutique, quietly, without fanfare, and stood for a moment just inside the entrance. The space was immaculate. Sunlight bounced off crystal chandeliers and sleek glass cases that cradled diamonds, emeralds, and handcrafted platinum rings. The scent of rosewood and vanilla lingered in the air, a signature touch she'd approved personally. But something felt off. No one greeted her, no one even acknowledged her. Behind the counter stood a young sales associate named Sienna, blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, tablet in hand, and next to her, Paul, the shift supervisor, crisp in a navy vest and silver tie pin. Both glanced up as the chime above the door rang. Their eyes met Amara's for a split second before looking past her, as if she were another browser they hoped wouldn't linger. Sienna tapped her screen and leaned in to whisper something to Paul. Paul barely nodded, then turned his attention back to reorganizing a tray of cufflinks. Amara took a few steps deeper into the store, pausing by a glass display showcasing limited edition sapphire earrings. Pieces she'd helped design herself. Still not a word, not even a "can I help you?" She caught Sienna watching her from the side, expression unreadable but far from welcoming. Paul glanced over again, then looked at the door as if silently wishing she'd take the hint and leave. For a store that marketed itself on exclusivity, wrapped in hospitality, the silence was louder than any insult. Amara said nothing. She didn't need to. She'd seen enough. What was meant to be a quiet check-in had just turned into a revealing mirror, one that reflected the very bias she'd built this brand to erase. Amara stood quietly near the platinum necklace display, her eyes calmly scanning the delicate pieces she had once helped sketch during late-night design meetings. She wasn't touching anything, just observing, soaking in the details, the ambiance, the body language of the staff. That's when Paul approached. He walked slowly, deliberately, with a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his tone edged with politeness so sharp it could cut glass. "We typically work by appointment here. If you didn't book ahead, I'll have to ask that you not handle the merchandise." Amara turned to face him, her voice even and composed. "I haven't touched anything. I'm just looking." Paul's smile faded slightly. "We try to maintain a certain atmosphere," he replied, glancing at her shoes before meeting her gaze again. "If you're not ready to make a purchase, we ask that guests allow space for clients who are." The implication was clear. She didn't look like a client, didn't belong in the luxury narrative they'd written for this place. Still, Amara didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or argue. She let a short silence settle between them before asking calmly, "Are you sure you want me to leave?" Her words weren't confrontational, just deliberate. Paul crossed his arms and nodded. "Absolutely." His voice had finality in it, as if her presence alone disrupted the harmony of the boutique. Around them, the air tightened. Sienna had stopped pretending to scroll on her tablet, now openly watching with a look of wary amusement. A man browsing cufflinks glanced their way before quickly looking back down, sensing something delicate unfolding. Amara looked around once more, not at the jewelry, but at the people, the energy, the subtle shift in temperature that occurred the moment she stepped through the door. Without another word, she nodded and walked toward the exit. No scene, no dramatic turn, just a quiet walk through a space she had created, now being told she didn't belong. The glass doors closed behind her with a gentle thud, but the weight of what had happened reverberated much louder. Outside, she paused under the California sun, pulled out her phone, and made a single call. "Give me 20 minutes, she said into the receiver, her tone measured, "and don't bring the car around yet." She leaned against the parking meter and took a slow breath. She wasn't surprised. This wasn't the first time. But what they didn't know, what they hadn't even bothered to ask, was who she was. And what was coming next would be more than a correction. It would be a lesson they'd never forget. 15 minutes later, the boutique's door chimed again, but this time Amara didn't walk in alone. At her side was Layla Brooks, the poised and formidable director of operations, and Julian Reyes, the head of people and training, both of whom had flown in for quarterly audits but were more than ready for an impromptu intervention. The moment the trio stepped through the entrance, the air in the boutique seemed to freeze. Conversations halted. Even the subtle background music felt quieter. Sienna looked up from her tablet and visibly tensed, her face draining of color as recognition crept in. Paul, who had been rearranging a tray of engagement rings, glanced up and blinked twice, confused by the sight of Amara now flanked by two corporate executives. Layla was the first to speak, her tone professional but sharp as glass. "Good afternoon, Paul," she said. "I assume you're aware of who Ms. Collins is." The use of Ms. Collins was deliberate, a formality that signaled respect and rank. Paul's expression faltered. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked between Layla and Amara, panic flickering behind his eyes as the realization took hold. Sienna, suddenly unsure of what to do with her hands, stepped back behind the counter, her posture collapsing into itself. Amara didn't raise her voice or break stride. She stepped forward, her tone calm, almost clinical. "I'm the founder and CEO of Oriel and Company, and this," she gestured around the boutique, "is our flagship location, the one you removed me from, without so much as asking my name." Her words weren't angry, just deeply measured, but the weight they carried was undeniable. The silence in the room grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Paul swallowed hard. His voice, when it finally returned, was thin and defensive. "We had no idea. I didn't realize." Amara held up a hand, not to silence, but to pause. "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You didn't ask. You assumed. You judged based on what I wore, not who I am. And if that's how leadership here treats guests, then I can only imagine how everyday clients are being treated when no one's watching." Julian stepped forward, silent until now. His expression was unreadable, but his presence added to the gravity of the moment. He didn't need to speak yet. His presence said enough. Amara glanced around the store one more time, then looked back at Paul. "This wasn't a test," she said, her voice now softer but firmer. "I didn't walk in expecting a confrontation. I walked in expecting courtesy. Respect. The kind we promise every customer in our mission statement." Her eyes flicked to the silver-framed plaque on the back wall where those very values were etched for all to see. "And today, you didn't just fail to deliver that. You proved why this company still has work to do." The message had landed, and no one in the room dared look away. Amara didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't pace or point fingers. Instead, she stood with the quiet strength of someone who had lived through the very thing she came to change. "I grew up in South Atlanta," she began, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. "My mother worked double shifts as a nurse's aide. I remember one afternoon when she took me into a jewelry store to look at a necklace she'd been saving for. She was wearing her scrubs. They asked her to leave before she said a word." The room stayed silent. Paul looked down. Sienna froze in place, eyes wide. "I built Oriel and Company to ensure stories like that didn't happen again. But walking into this store today, I saw my mother all over again. Not in the mirrors, but in the way I was looking at. In the way I was dismissed. There was no tremble in her voice, just a quiet authority that filled the space more than any shouting could. Julian stepped forward, nodding slowly before speaking. We train our staff on product specs, brand tone, and how to polish a display case until it shines, he said, his tone calm but edged with disappointment. But we've failed at something deeper. We haven't trained on humanity, on how to check our assumptions, how to listen without filters, how to see the person in front of you instead of the stereotype in your head. His words didn't accuse, they illuminated. Layla, without a word, stepped toward the counter and handed Sienna a folder. Customer feedback, she said. Every one of these is from someone who walked into one of our stores and felt less than. Sienna hesitated before opening it, hands visibly trembling. The top card read, "Walked in with my husband. No one looked up until a white couple entered. We were treated like we didn't belong. We left, never returned." She blinked hard and quickly shut the folder, her breath catching. Amara watched her, not with cruelty, but with clarity. "I'm not disappointed that you didn't recognize me," she said softly. "I'm disappointed that you haven't been recognizing anyone." That line didn't echo, it landed. It shifted the energy in the room like a subtle earthquake. Paul's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of what had just been said finally registered. Julian remained still, arms folded, eyes scanning the reactions like a teacher observing a turning point in a classroom. "This isn't about a single mistake," Amara continued. "It's about a pattern, a culture, that tells certain people they have to prove they belong in spaces they helped build. I'm here to tell you. That ends today." Her gaze swept the boutique, not just addressing those present, but invoking the thousands who had likely experienced the same silent dismissal. "Respect isn't a perk," she said. "It's the baseline. It should never be earned by appearance. It should be offered by default." The boutique was still gleaming, still polished, but now it felt like a different place. Not because the cases had changed, but because the truth had been spoken out loud, and there was no one hearing it. Amara didn't believe in performative punishment or public humiliation. She believed in transformation. That's why, instead of firing Paul on the spot, she took a different approach. "You're going on paid leave for 2 weeks," she told him, her tone clear but not cruel. "But that time isn't for rest. It's for reflection. You'll write a full account of what happened here today. Not just what you did, but what you were thinking, what you assumed, and what you've learned." Paul didn't argue. He nodded once, slowly, as if the gravity of the assignment weighed more than any disciplinary form ever could. Then she turned to Sienna. "You'll remain on the floor," she said, "but under direct supervision and enrolled in our Human First training program, starting tomorrow." The program wasn't just about customer service, it was about perspective. Built from real client stories and led by social psychologists, it focused on recognizing unconscious bias, reading non-verbal cues, and engaging every customer with the same dignity, regardless of their attire, tone, or perceived status. Julian stepped in to add structure to the plan. "In addition," he said, "this store will begin hosting monthly listening sessions where we invite actual clients who felt ignored or dismissed to share their stories in person, with the team that served them. These won't be surveys. They'll be conversations, unfiltered and unedited." Layla nodded in agreement, already texting HQ to arrange the first session. Amara turned to the room, staff, trainees, even the silent security guard near the back, and spoke not as a CEO, but as a founder reclaiming her vision. "Auriel and Company was never meant to represent exclusivity," she said, "but value. Value of people, of stories, of how we treat one another. Luxury doesn't mean shutting the door on people. It means inviting them into a space where they feel seen." Her words didn't sound rehearsed. They rang with intention, lived experience, and purpose. "I didn't build this brand to impress a boardroom," she continued. "I built it to challenge a narrative that said people like me didn't belong in spaces like this. But we do. And so do the women in hoodies, the men in work boots, the mothers holding 2 toddlers. Because dignity isn't determined by style, it's reflected in service." Sienna looked up, visibly shaken but not defensive. Something in her had shifted, not from guilt, but from the realization that she had, perhaps for the first time, truly listened. Paul stayed quiet, still processing, but there was no resistance in his posture. Just the slow awareness of how far he had drifted from the values etched in the company's mission statement. Around them, the boutique looked the same: polished counters, glittering glass, curated playlists. But at that moment, it wasn't about appearances. It was about reckoning and rebuilding. Amara didn't deliver mandates, she opened the doors. And by doing so, she made it clear. Change wouldn't be a memo. It would be a movement, starting right here in the very space that had tried to push her out. 3 weeks later, under the bright lights of the National Retail Leadership Summit in New York City, Amara Collins stepped onto the main stage to address a packed room of executives, founders, and rising entrepreneurs. She wasn't introduced with fanfare or a dramatic video reel, just her name and title, which now carried a weight far beyond job description. Standing at the podium in a sleek navy blazer and her signature understated gold necklace, Amara didn't recount the story of what happened in the Santa Monica boutique. She didn't need to. Instead, she spoke about culture, the kind that gets silently shaped behind polished counters and inside hiring practices, training modules, and employee handbooks that never mention race, but somehow still make people feel like outsiders. "I used to think success was about being recognized," she said, her voice calm, measured, and deliberate. "But now I know. It's about being respected, even when you're invisible." Her words didn't echo through the ballroom, they sank in. CEOs leaned forward, heads nodded. Phones stopped recording as hands slowly lowered, replaced by reflection. She called for a new era of leadership, one not driven by optics, but by ownership. Not by performative pledges, but by daily decisions that restore dignity. She challenged them to look at their storefronts, their staff, their systems, and ask not just, "Are we inclusive?" but "Do people feel safe being fully themselves here?" And then she paused, let the moment breathe, and offered the lesson that had crystallized over years of resilience. True discrimination often doesn't scream. It whispers. It shows up in who gets greeted and who gets ignored, in who is assumed to be browsing and who is assumed to be buying. It hides in dress codes, security glances, and the silence that follows someone asking for help. It's not always intentional, but that doesn't make it harmless. Respect shouldn't be reserved for the familiar or the affluent. It must be the default. Power doesn't come from your title, it comes from how you choose to use your influence when no one's watching. And sometimes the greatest strength isn't in fighting for a seat at the table, but in building a new table altogether. When you rebuild the very place that once rejected you, you're not just rising. You're lifting the ceiling for everyone after you. Leadership isn't about perfection. It's about reflection, accountability, and the courage to create spaces where no one has to shrink to fit in. Because what defines a brand, a business, or a legacy is not the quality of its product, but the integrity of its presence. As she stepped down from the stage to a standing ovation, Amara didn't smile for the applause. She smiled for what it represented. Not recognition, but resonance. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It was a mirror, a movement, and a message that finally had found its voice. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or see the world a little differently, then you're exactly who we create these stories for. At X Daily Stories, we don't just tell tales. We spotlight the quiet strength, the hidden battles, and the everyday moments that expose bigger truths about justice, identity, and dignity. Because sometimes the most powerful changes don't come from the headlines, but from what happens in rooms where no one expects you to speak up. Subscribe to X Daily Stories for more real, raw, and unforgettable narratives. We drop new stories every single day, and trust us, you won't want to miss what's next. Your story matters, your voice belongs, and someone out there needs to hear exactly what you just heard. Hit that subscribe button. Let's change the story together.